Hello, welcome to this overview of the content for Module 8, which covers how the parts of personality fit together. Personality structure is considered in this unit, and it is defined basically as the long-term division of personality into areas according to specifiable rules. The divisions can be according to distinct functions that are relatively stable, like controlling emotions, or performance of emotions, expression of emotions, descriptive characteristics like awareness, or other qualities like how traits relate to one another. If you contrast personality structure to personality dynamics, it's interesting to look at that difference. Dynamics concern the interactions among the areas or parts, whereas structure talks about what each part does or is for. It's important to think about this while you're reading about theories about personality structure. More than one way of describing them can be accurate or possible. There's a truth out there, but researchers are trying to figure out what that is. So this example here is a metaphor with maps. More than one valid map is possible. Different maps focus on different attributes. So here's a map of maps of Manhattan. One looks at subway routes, one looks at tourist attractions, one looks at neighborhoods, and one looks at roads or whatever this one is. So it's just showing that there are different maps of the same thing. None of them is wrong, but they feature different attributes or functions or things you might be looking for in Manhattan, and you can apply that metaphor to understanding personality. And every map or theory or discussion about personality structure helps describe a different aspect of the same reality. And without a map to guide us, we'd be lost. So we're trying to figure out how things work and how they're laid out. So these theories and maps can be guides for us. Structural divisions that are useful need to be comprehensive and explain much about personality, not just one tiny aspect. They need to be empirically accurate, so tested, and have some proof behind them. Obviously, newer theories now would be based on past theories, but people who were initial theorists were kind of developing ideas that needed to be empirically supported. They need to be divided well and talk about distinct areas of personality, and they need to possess utility, be useful, help guide future research, and help guide how the information is applied in practice, for example, in teaching. So these are some of the keys to good structure, or good structural analysis of personality. There are two approaches to talking about what the structure of personality is, or to finding it out. One is the mathematical approach, and one is the conceptual approach. In a mathematical approach, factor analysis is used, and our author does a nice job describing this in our textbook. But basically, researchers look at what parts of personality rise and fall together or are grouped together, and they come up with clusters or factors that might look at different ways people behave, and those factors could suggest that there are underlying structures that control them. This is a nice method in that it's fairly, I shouldn't say easy, but straightforward to test and gather data about and try to find factors within that data. I'm being very non-technical here, but it's limited in that it tends to describe traits, but not really necessarily how those traits work or interact. Conceptual models, on the other hand, are theoretical and definitional, and they're sometimes related to the brain, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here. An example of a conceptual model would be Freud's idea that we have an id, an ego, and a superego that aren't necessarily physical organs, but they're structures that have different functions and control our perceptions and behaviors, and are manifested in our personality. A pro to a conceptual model is that it can describe broader and aspects of personality and give a more holistic explanation of how personality works. And a con, of course, is that disagreements arise because the empirical proof is not necessarily there to support any particular conceptual model. Math-based structures are determined by using covariance to get correlations among different traits. So if a person behaves in ways X and Y, do they tend to do that together? What do people with trait X act like? What do people with trait Y act or feel like? Things of that nature are determined by correlations and covariance. They look at how variables are at high or low levels within and among people, and they talk about those as traits, which are identified through factor analysis. I think this makes intuitive sense to you, and I'll show you a model in a minute that might help. So the structure of personality is reflected in the structure of the correlation matrix among the traits that the researchers measure. An example of a kind of straightforward, easy to describe model is the Big Five model, which has been tested and adapted, but it's kind of borne the test of time to a certain extent. And there are also 3 strata models of intelligence, and models of intelligence, for example, that we talked about in Module 6 that look at general intelligence and then have specific abilities that feed into or are part of that broad overall G intelligence. So these are examples of math-based structural models of personality or mental functions related to personality. Here's an example of the Big Five model, and there's another big slide with the graphic coming. And basically the purpose of this mathematical model to describe the structure of personality is that it organizes all the traits into one construct personality. And now, are they really all the traits? Not necessarily. They're all the traits that were measured and tested and correlated with one another. This model does depend on the idea that traits are found in language and we can describe them. And of course, language does have some limits. If you've taken ED 601, you know that there's some debate about how cognition is affected by language and how language affects cognition. So this makes an assumption that we can describe our traits with language. And that may or may not be 100% true. Basically, to develop this model, trait words are factor analyzed to yield clusters or important traits. And lots of words are given to people, and they verify whether those apply to them or not, and then they're correlated with other people's responses to see what traits hang together in people. And this has yielded 5 factors of personality that do seem to have some utility and make sense to researchers. And the model, like I say, has kind of borne the test of time to a degree. It's a good model, but it is limited to only about 30 traits, and they're based on lay perception rather than professional expertise. And it does exclude, this is kind of an important caveat about using this model, it doesn't cover every trait or ability. It doesn't necessarily address verbal intelligence, internal, external locus of control, emotional intelligence, Machiavellianism, and things of that nature. There are things that it does not test that we would probably argue as teachers and people do relate to personality and the expression of personality. So it has its limits. This is a bigger graphic of this, just to kind of show you the way specific characteristics of people or traits correlate together and form these 5 factors that many people agree are major components of personality. I shouldn't say main, but major components of personality. I'll let you read about that more at your leisure. So to get away from mathematical models, I want to just touch on the idea that there are conceptual models too. Conceptual models try to describe sometimes the function of personality. Functional models look at personality in terms of what are the main psychological functions that the system carries out and how does it do so. So one example of this is the idea that we have System 1 and System 2 thinking. That's kind of a current model that's based on Freud's earlier ideas. And you should review Freud's ideas in the readings because he certainly had a lot of early influence on the ideas about personality. And some of his ideas have borne the test of time as well. One critical idea that Freud developed was that we have different levels of consciousness and that there are parts in our brain or our life that we are unconscious of, completely unaware of, somewhat conscious of, or aware of and conscious of, able to manipulate mentally in our minds. That idea has really kind of borne the test of time. In System 1 and 2 thinking, which is more current, a current way to label and look at this, there are 2 systems of thought that go on. There's System 1, which is unconscious, requires little effort, is rapid, associative. We just associate things through, it kind of goes along with behavioral thinking theory, and has an evolutionary basis, so kind of survival behaviors, for example, maybe. And System 2 thinking is more conscious, explicit, logical, slow, and rule-based. That certainly applies to teaching. Things like, teaching kids rules of language for writing. Kids have to manipulate information, think about it, apply rules, and so forth, as opposed to System 1 where they're just reacting. It's almost more, I'm putting this in layman's terms, but more like instinct, not aware of what they're doing. Whereas in school, you're teaching children to apply rules and think about what they're doing and make conscious choices all the time. And you can see how this relates to Freud's ideas of unconscious and consciousness. And then that evolved a little bit later into the idea that we have these psychological structures, the id, the ego, and the superego, that vary in how consciously controlled they are. So you can see the evolution here from the early 1900s to today, how Freud's model has kind of hung in there, but the terminology has changed and the focus is less on these particular structures that we talked about in the last module too, about the iceberg model, if you remember that visual. They've evolved into this way of thinking about the structures of personality in terms of consciousness and unconsciousness, but they're still there. Here's a nice graphic too, provided by our author, that talks about how Freud's structural division of personality can be looked at through an evolutionary lens and also applied to a developmental model. So I referred to ED 601 before. You'll probably all have to take that course, and you've probably had a lot of child development study in your education background. But it's kind of interesting to look at how this might apply to the developmental progression in life too. As our personality develops, our consciousness may change too, and it may serve different functions, from survival to thinking and solving problems to actually getting along in society. So it's interesting to look at those different viewpoints or through those lenses at these psychological or personality structures. Our readings this unit or module talk about the trilogy of mind as well, which is an important model about an important conceptual model of personality. In the trilogy of mind, there are 3 parts of the mind that are important that certainly relate to personality and relate to the modules we've been talking about. Cognition, which would relate to our mental models. Emotion, obviously that relates to personality and relationships. And our biology. There's a lot of current research and information about how neurochemistry affects our emotions. And our motivation, which obviously has nature and nurture influences as well, probably some evolutionary basis as well as learned basis. And all 3 of those interact with one another. You can read the definitions here. And this model is often applied in many theoretical models of personality. There is evidence that our brain, the biology, actually kind of matches this trilogy of mind, that there are parts in our brain that kind of reflect a reptilian brain, if you will, are more survival related. In the old mammalian brain, functions like caregiving for the young, emotions, and socialization are controlled, if you will. Probably not in full, but they're primary areas for controlling those functions. And in the newer mammalian brain, to keep going with that evolutionary model or metaphor, language and higher cognitive functioning is controlled. And it's kind of interesting to flip back here. If you look at where this happens in the brain, kind of deep within the brain, and then more within the brain. However, the last level that looks at language and higher cognitive functioning, executive control, things of that nature that you read about, say, as teachers in terms of, what's ADHD, what's happening in the brain in cases like that. A lot of that is purported to relate to the cortex, so the higher level thinking. It's further out from the center of the brain stem. So it's interesting to see how biology matches these theories, even though some of those theories were developed before we had the technology to really see the brain very well. Certainly they could do dissections and so forth, but now we have a lot more technology to actually see where activity is happening. A more sensible division, according to our author and based on modern research, for personality is into a 4-component structural model that our author refers to as the personality systems set, and the text itself is called a systems approach to personality. So systems is an important concept, that there are these structures, but they interact with one another, and they are described here and in our text. In the interest of keeping this lecture reasonable, I'm not going to read this to you, but it's very important. So Mayer has taken this past knowledge and putting it into a more current model that incorporates a lot of the past research and explains more about personality and behavior. Mayer would not reject the idea that there is an unconscious level of thinking. Not everything is directly conscious. We're not directly able to access and think about everything every stimulus that we're exposed to. There are some different historical views about awareness, and contemporary views would describe consciousness with a little more detail than Freud did here. You can read this, but they would go from either unconscious material we cannot access to being totally conscious of what we're dealing with. So you can see how that model's evolved. And here's an example of unconscious, not awareness, unawareness, where you're completely unable to access information. For example, we see things, but we don't have any conscious awareness of how our eye is working. And our text talks about illusions too, briefly. So here's an example where the bar is the same color, but it looks different in the different contexts. And we know this, the author uses this as an example because we understand that it's the same, but we can't change our brain from recognizing one bar is different than the other, because unconsciously it looks different, even though we know it's not. This describes some of the different levels of consciousness too. I'll let you read this slide for yourself, but basically shows how people can know that they're influenced by something, but not really, but also not know it. So we are influenced, we can be manipulated by things that we're exposed to, whether it's intentional or not. That certainly applies to advertising, and it may apply to things you do with your students too, to encourage them and motivate them in your classroom. An important point about dynamics is that a dynamic model looks at how things interact and how they do things. Dynamism implies motion or action. Freud's topological model of the unconscious to the consciousness, if you took a dynamic view of that, his theory falls under the psychodynamic model, suggests that there's active repression. Our ego expels thoughts and feelings that are threatening to us. It's not just happening willy-nilly, even though we're not completely aware of what we're doing. So there's active repression in a dynamic model. This is a nice graphic. It's a little messy looking, but it shows how the system's components of personality also relate to traits. So it shows how some of the old research, not old, older than now, can be integrated, and a lot of the ideas don't need to be, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you will. They work together and can support each other and explain how personality functions. The textbook we used most recently in this course was written by Michel, and I wanted to show you this slide too, because an important part of his model is that we behave based on what's in our minds and our personality, but that's influenced by the situation too. That seems like common sense. It certainly relates to social learning theory, you know, and that we have our expression of our emotions and our behaviors, but they're influenced by the environment, as the behaviorists would say, but also by our emotions and thoughts. So that was the expansion of behaviorism to social learning theory. They added in the idea that our thinking and our feeling matter too, not just the environment. Skinner thought that the environment determined our behavior. And finally, here's a slide with a couple questions for you to think about. How does this information about the structure and function of personality parts apply to me as a teacher? So I would like you to read these questions and think about how these ideas are applied at your school. How do you use them, and do they help your students develop self-esteem, have better achievement, and better relationships? And in particular, I'd like you to think about the newer model, the systems view of personality, and think about how that can help you develop effective interventions. Thanks, and have a great day.